25 canning tricks. Your grandma used to keep food fresh all year. Do you remember the rows of colorful jars lining grandma's pantry shelves? Before refrigeration became widespread, canning was how families survived the winter months. Today we're exploring 25 time-tested canning tricks that kept food fresh all year long. Let's start with sterilizing jars properly. Your grandma knew that cleanliness was the foundation of safe canning. She'd place her mason jars in a large pot of boiling water for at least 10 minutes, or run them through the hottest dishwasher cycle. But here's what many people don't know. She'd keep those jars hot until the moment she filled them. That's right, hot jars for hot food prevented thermal shock that could crack the glass. She'd use special jar lifters or thick towels to handle them, and she'd sterilize the lids too, keeping them in simmering water until needed. This simple step prevented contamination that could spoil months of hard work. In the 1940s and 50s, when antibiotics weren't readily available, food poisoning could be deadly, so Grandma took no chances, using new lids every time. While Grandma was frugal and saved everything, she never reused canning lids. Those thin rubber seals were designed for one-time use only. She understood that the sealing compound on the lid softened during processing and molded to the jar rim, creating an airtight seal. Once used, that compound couldn't form a proper seal again. She'd buy her lids in bulk at the hardware store, often for just pennies each. The metal bands, however, were a different story. She'd wash and reuse those for decades, passing them down through generations. Some families still have Grandma's original bands from the 1930s. She knew that a failed seal meant botulism risk, and no amount of saved pennies was worth that danger. Hot pack versus cold pack. Your grandma understood the science behind hot packing long before it was explained in modern canning guides. For tomatoes, peaches, and pears, she'd simmer the food first, then pack it into jars while still hot. This method removed air from the food tissues, making the contents more stable and less likely to float. Cold packing was reserved for delicate items like cucumber pickles that would fall apart if pre-cooked. She knew hot packing created better color retention and prevented that unsightly separation where all the fruit floated to the top of the jar. Plus, hot-packed foods required less processing time, which meant better texture and flavor. Imagine that. Grandma was practicing food science without ever taking a chemistry class, adding acid for safety. Long before anyone talked about pH levels, Grandma knew that adding lemon juice or vinegar to certain foods was crucial for safety. She'd add a tablespoon of lemon juice to each quart of tomatoes, even though her garden tomatoes were more acidic than today's varieties. For her famous bread and butter pickles, she used a precise ratio of vinegar to water that had been passed down from her mother. This wasn't just about taste. The acid prevented deadly bacteria from growing. In fact, the USDA didn't officially recommend adding acid to tomatoes until the 1970s, but Grandma had been doing it for decades. She'd squeeze her own lemons when possible, but kept bottled juice on hand for consistency. Blanching vegetables first. Before any vegetable went into a canning jar, Grandma gave it a quick dip in boiling water. She'd blanch green beans for exactly 3 minutes, corn for 4, and peas for 2. This wasn't arbitrary. She knew blanching stopped enzyme action that could cause loss of flavor, color, and texture. After blanching, she'd plunge the vegetables into ice water to stop the cooking process. This extra step meant her canned vegetables tasted fresh even in the dead of winter. She'd often blanch huge batches, working with her sisters or neighbors in an assembly line. The blanching water wasn't wasted either. It became the base for vegetable soup stock, pressure canning for low-acid foods. Grandma's pressure canner was her most prized kitchen tool, often costing more than a month's grocery budget in the 1940s. She knew that vegetables, meats, and soups needed temperatures above boiling to be safe. Her pressure canner could reach 240 degrees Celsius at 10 pounds of pressure, hot enough to destroy botulism spores. She'd check the pressure gauge religiously, even taking it to the county extension office for testing each year. The weighted gauge would rock steadily during processing, creating a rhythmic sound that meant safety. She kept detailed notes about processing times for different foods at her altitude: 75 minutes for quarts of green beans, 90 minutes for meat. That pressure canner often outlived its owner, passed down as a family heirloom. Layering fruit with sugar. When making preserves, Grandma had a special technique. She'd layer fresh strawberries or peaches with sugar in a large bowl, then let it sit overnight. This process, called maceration, drew out the natural fruit juices and created a syrup without adding water. The fruit would shrink slightly, concentrating the flavor. She'd use about 3/4 cup of sugar per pound of fruit, adjusting for tartness. This method meant her jams were intensely fruity, not watered down like store-bought versions. The sugar also acted as a preservative, and the overnight rest meant less cooking time, which preserved more vitamins. She'd often do this on her back porch on summer evenings, the sweet smell attracting every bee in the neighborhood, using the right salt. Grandma always kept 2 kinds of salt in her canning cupboard: regular table salt for cooking and pure canning salt for preserving. She knew that iodized salt would turn her pickles dark and create cloudy brine. Anti-caking agents in table salt could make the liquid murky too. Her canning salt came in large boxes, pure and additive-free. She'd measure carefully: too little salt, and foods could spoil; too much, and they'd be inedible. For her dill pickles, she used exactly 1 cup of salt per gallon of water. She'd dissolve it completely before adding to the jars, stirring with a wooden spoon that had been in the family for generations. Water bath processing. For high-acid foods like fruits, jams, and pickles, Grandma relied on her blue speckled water bath canner. She'd fill it halfway with water and bring it to a simmer while preparing her jars. The rack inside kept jars from touching the bottom, where they might crack from direct heat. She knew to keep the water at least an inch above the jar tops and to maintain a steady boil throughout processing. Her kitchen windows would fog up from the steam, but she never opened them. Drafts could cause temperature fluctuations. Processing times were sacred: 10 minutes for half-pint jams, 15 for pints, adjusted for altitude. She'd start timing only after the water returned to a full boil, proper headspace. Grandma had a wooden ruler specifically for canning, marked at 1/4-inch intervals. She knew that leaving exactly the right amount of space at the top of each jar was crucial. Too little headspace and the contents could bubble out during processing, preventing a seal. Too much and the jar might not seal properly because there wasn't enough heat to drive out all the air. For jams, she left a 1/4 inch. For fruits, 1/2 inch. For vegetables, a full inch. This wasn't guesswork. These measurements came from years of experience and countless jars that had to be reprocessed. Avoiding overfilled jars. Speaking of headspace, Grandma was meticulous about not overfilling her jars. She understood that food expands when heated, and overfilled jars could force food between the lid and rim, preventing a proper seal. She'd use a wide-mouth funnel and fill carefully, often keeping a damp cloth nearby to wipe the jar rims clean. Any food residue on the rim meant a failed seal. She'd rather process an extra partial jar than risk overfilling. Those partial jars went straight to the refrigerator for immediate use. Nothing was wasted in Grandma's kitchen. Testing the seal. After processing, Grandma had a foolproof method for checking seals. She'd let the jars cool completely on a folded towel, away from drafts. After 12 to 24 hours, she'd press the center of each lid. A properly sealed lid wouldn't move. She'd also tap it with a spoon. A clear, high-pitched ring meant success, while a dull thud meant failure. Any unsealed jars went straight to the refrigerator for immediate use. She'd often check again before storing, and once more before opening months later. This vigilance meant her family never ate spoiled food. Think about that. No refrigeration for most foods, yet perfect safety record. Cooling jars properly. Grandma knew that proper cooling was just as important as proper heating. She'd never move jars immediately after processing. Instead, she'd lift them straight up out of the canner and set them on a towel-lined counter, spacing them at least an inch apart for air circulation. She'd learned the hard way that setting hot jars on a cold surface could cause them to crack. The kitchen would be off-limits during cooling, no slamming doors or running through. She'd listen for the distinctive ping as each jar sealed, counting them like a prayer. Those pings meant food security for her family, storing in cool, dark places. Grandma's root cellar was her treasure vault. She kept it at a steady 50-60 degrees year-round with wooden shelves she'd built herself. Each shelf was labeled by year and contents. Light could fade colors and break down vitamins, so her cellar had just one small window covered with burlap. She'd rotate stock religiously, oldest jars in front, newest in back. Moisture was the enemy, so she'd run a dehumidifier in damp seasons. Some of her jars would keep for years, though she aimed to use everything within 12 months. That root cellar fed her family through the Great Depression and World War II rationing, dating, and rotating stock. Every jar that came out of Grandma's canner got a label. She'd write the contents and date in her careful script on masking tape. But she went further. She kept a canning journal, recording what she preserved, how much and when it was used. This helped her plan next year's garden and canning schedule. She'd do inventory each spring, using up older jars first and noting what ran out too quickly. Her rotation system was simple but effective. New jars went to the back, older ones moved forward. This practice prevented waste and ensured her family always ate the freshest preserved foods, preventing overcrowding in the canner. Grandma learned through experience that cramming too many jars into the canner was counterproductive. Water needed to circulate freely around each jar for even heating. She'd process in batches rather than overcrowd, even if it meant the canning session stretched late into the night. Her water bath canner held 7 quart jars comfortably, and that's exactly what she'd process, never ate. For her pressure canner, she'd stagger jars on 2 levels, using the special rack that came with it. This patience meant every jar processed safely and sealed properly. Hard to believe, right? All that extra work, but it guaranteed success. Double-checking vacuum seals. Beyond the initial seal test, Grandma had another trick. Before storing jars, she'd remove the bands and try to lift each jar by the lid edge. A properly sealed jar would hold firm. She stored jars without bands because rust could make them difficult to remove later, and a loose band might hide a failed seal. She'd wash and dry the bands for reuse, storing them in a cloth bag in her pantry. This bare lid storage method meant she could spot any problems immediately. If a seal failed during storage, the lid would be obviously loose or off, adding natural sweeteners. While white sugar was standard, Grandma also used honey and maple syrup in her canning. For apple butter, she'd use half honey, half sugar, creating a complex flavor that store-bought versions couldn't match. Her fruit syrups often included a tablespoon of honey per quart, which helped preserve color and added subtle flavor notes. During sugar rationing in the 1940s, she relied entirely on honey from her own beehives. She knew that honey's natural antimicrobial properties provided extra protection against spoilage. The key was adding sweeteners at the right time. Too early, and they could scorch. Too late, and they wouldn't fully incorporate. Preventing overcooked fruits. Grandma had a gentle touch with fruits. She knew that overcooking destroyed not just texture, but also precious vitamins. For peaches, she'd bring the syrup to a boil, then turn off the heat before adding the fruit. The residual heat was enough to warm them through without making them mushy. For berries, she'd use the raw pack method, pouring hot syrup over fresh fruit in the jars. Her strawberry preserves kept whole berries intact, swimming in ruby red syrup. She'd process fruits for the minimum safe time, not a minute more. This meant her canned peaches in January tasted almost as good as fresh ones in July. Timing everything precisely. In Grandma's kitchen, the timer was sacred. She had an old wind-up kitchen timer that she'd used since her wedding day. Processing times weren't suggestions, they were law. She knew that under-processing could mean dangerous bacteria survived, while over-processing meant mushy vegetables and destroyed nutrients. She'd write processing times on her recipe cards in red ink so they stood out. If the power went out mid-process, she'd start the timing over from the beginning rather than guess. That level of precision might seem excessive today, but remember, there were no antibiotics readily available if someone got food poisoning. Adjusting for altitude. Living at 3,000 feet elevation, Grandma knew she couldn't follow sea-level canning instructions. She'd add extra processing time for water bath canning, 5 minutes more for her elevation. For pressure canning, she'd increase the pressure by 1 pound. She kept a chart tacked inside her pantry door with all the adjustments. When her daughter moved to Denver at 5,000 feet, Grandma sent detailed instructions for high-altitude canning. She understood that water boils at lower temperatures at higher elevations, requiring these adjustments for safety. Many failed canning attempts could be traced to ignoring altitude differences. Preheating jars. Thermal shock was the enemy of glass jars. Grandma would preheat her jars in a pan of simmering water or in her oven set at 200 degree hours. She'd time it so jars were hot when her food was ready. For raw packing, she'd use warm jars. For hot packing, the jars needed to be hot. She'd seen too many jars crack when hot food hit cold glass, wasting both food and jar. Her jar lifters had rubber grips, worn smooth from decades of use. She'd move methodically. Jar from hot water, fill immediately, apply lid into the canner. This rhythm prevented jars from cooling down between steps, using a canning funnel. Grandma's wide-mouth canning funnel was stainless steel, not plastic. She knew that keeping jar rims clean was crucial for proper sealing, and the funnel prevented spills. She'd hold it steady with one hand while ladling with the other, a practiced motion that came from years of experience. After filling each jar, she'd wipe the rim with a damp cloth dipped in vinegar. The acid cut through any grease or residue. Her funnel had measurement marks on the inside, helping her maintain proper headspace. She'd wash it between different foods to prevent flavor transfer. Let that sink in. Such attention to detail in every step. Combining preservation methods. While we're focusing on canning, Grandma knew that dehydration added another layer of preservation. She'd often dehydrate vegetables before canning them in oil, creating concentrated flavors. Her sun-dried tomatoes, packed in olive oil with herbs, were legendary. She'd dehydrate apple slices, then can them in light syrup for pies that tasted incredibly fresh. Beans might be partially dried before canning, concentrating their flavor and reducing processing time. This combination approach meant more variety in her pantry and foods that lasted even longer than single-method preservation, making it flavorful. Grandma never canned plain food. Her green beans included dill and garlic. Her peaches had a cinnamon stick in each jar. Her tomatoes were seasoned with basil from her garden. She'd pack grape leaves in pickle jars to keep them crisp and add bay leaves to canned meats. These weren't random additions. Each herb and spice was chosen for both flavor and preservation properties. Cloves have antimicrobial properties. Dill contains essential oils that help preserve. She'd grow her own herbs, drying them at their peak for year-round use. Her spice cabinet was organized by canning use. Which ones went with fruits, vegetables, or meats? Thanks for joining us on this trip down memory lane. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and share it with a friend.